To the VC, Professor Nana Poku, the DVCs present, the deans of schools, academic leaders, and other leaders, including the SRC, members of the media, the public, the students, colleagues, I greet you all. Today is an important day in the School of Social Sciences, where we are trying to understand the Fees Must Fall movement of 2015. And this public lecture is going to carve the way forward as to what needs to be done in the future if we experience the same problems. And before I waste so much of the time and abuse the powers that have been given to me to be the program director, I would like to take this opportunity and hand it over to our own Professor Vivian Ojong, who is the Acting Dean and Head of School of Social Sciences, to give us an opening of this lecture and as well as the words of welcome. Over to you, Professor Ojong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Program Director, Dr. Gumede. I greet our distinguished academics, members from the media, our students, and the wider audience that we have today. You're welcome to the School of Social Sciences. For us, this is indeed a very important day, especially looking at the activities within our university from the beginning of 2020. And these activities have greatly been influenced by some actions and some activism from the part of the students, and we have seen how it has introduced vast changes in how we carry out our activities at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Students around the world have been noted for being at the forefront of major reforms taking place in different countries. It is not new. And protest action driven by students was very pivotal in bringing down the apartheid regime in South Africa. We also saw as way back as October 2015, where with the hashtag Fees Must Fall campaign, and how our students rallied all over the country, all institutions, and how it has actually introduced and changed the landscape of higher education in the country as we used to know it and as we have come to know it now. And we know that this change is continuing. The impact from that, especially from the Fees Must Fall campaign, is not only experience in the lives of the students concerned and their families, but it has also in a very large extent impacted on how universities, especially the University of KwaZulu-Natal, carries out its academic project. It has changed the way we look at recruitment, and when we are recruiting, who do we recruit? It has also changed the way we look at academic promotions. It has changed the way we look at strategies of even retaining staff. It has also changed the way we look at funding, because the Fees Must Fall campaign, if you all remember, it came with a call for the eradication of school fees. And so that has meant that as an institution, the student activism had to bring us to the place to begin to rethink on how we can continue to engage in the academic project in a very sustainable way, and also allowing the communities that we serve to benefit from the skills that are vested in the university. We have seen from 2016 up to January and February of 2020 how such actions was followed by violence, and we got to a point where we were engaged in this blame game No one was willing to take responsibility for the violence that was happening around. But the question that begs, as we observe the student protests and student activism, was whether we should, as an institution, lose our heritage as we strive to transform, as we strive to allow our students and give them the space to express themselves, because we are actually promoting an environment where they're free to express their views without fear from any kind of a structure. But how do we allow our institutions to change? How do we allow that without endangering our heritage? So you can see from the way the panel has been cleverly selected, from the speakers we have as students. So we'll have somebody speaking from among the students to give us a perspective. And also in the panel we have someone who has also been part of building that heritage. So I'm anticipating a very robust debate and an atmosphere where we can begin to understand from all the sides what is really happening. And as an institution, what do we want to be known for? In as much as we want transformation, we want change, we want education that is accessible to all. How do we do that in an environment that is not violent, in an environment that is respectful, and an environment where we can be proud of, where people elsewhere, located elsewhere, even within South Africa and outside of South Africa, can be proud to come and be part of this heritage. So without taking much space, I would like to thank you, Program Director, and hand it back to you, and welcome everyone, and please be free to participate, even in giving a comment. We want to get as much as possible, and that even after the webinar, we can continue with these debates and discussions outside. You can contact us through the organizers of this, and we feel that this is the starting point, because an hour or two is not enough to discuss something of such significance in the School of Social Sciences and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Thank you so much, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Professor Ojong, for giving us the background of how Fees Must Fall movement has played an important role in the way in which student activism is perceived by management of this institution of the University of KwaZulu-Natal and the university at large. With that background, may I take this opportunity and hand over the program to our own Professor Dr. Hari Masondo to give us an overview of the Culture Cluster Public Lecture Series. Over to you, Dr. Masondo. Thank you.
My UKZN, my heritage, my UKZN, my home. Isikhathi, lixesha, kinako. It's time for us to look at you, UKZN. It's time for us to talk about you. I treasure you. I treasure your beauty, my UKZN. I salute your durability. You gave birth to all Premier Zigalala, leaders, premiers of KwaZulu-Natal. You gave birth to professionals. Oh, my UKZN. Oh, my heritage. Oh, my home. Iskati, lixesha, kenako. It's time for us to talk about you, to look at you. May you live forever. May you enjoy the pain and injury you have experienced, so that the next generation may find you the way you are supposed to be. You provide us with 5 homes within you. We have PMB, we have Edgewood, we have Westville, we have Howard, we have medical school. Oh, my UKZN, oh, my heritage, oh, my UKZN. UKZN, oh my home, isikhathi lixesha ke nako. It's time for us to look at you. It's time for us to talk about you. PMB, why are there barricades? Why do I see fire? Jude, why are the cars burning? Jude, why are you injuring the important room allocated for the examination? Westville, why do I see the RMS burning down the fridges, the beds? Why? Oh, my UKZN, my heritage, my UKZN, my home. It's time to look at you and to talk about you. Medical home, please give us the way to solve this problem of destruction of our heritage. My UKZN, my home, my UKZN, my heritage. Allow Mr. Lukhona Mguni to do a checkup on our UKZN, our home. Allow him to do an operation because you are injured. Allow Professor Paulo Zulu to be a pharmacist today, to prescribe to us the appropriate medication like antibiotics, painkillers, so that we can be discharged. Greetings, everyone. This is a great day for our university. I have been tasked to talk about the origin of this public lecture. This public lecture originated in an interview room where I remember very well, the panel asked me, and in that panel, our dean, acting dean then was Professor Surya Murthy, a wonderful leader indeed. And they asked me about my vision since I applied to be the cluster leader of the culture. And among the answers that I gave them, the most important one is the one that relates with this public lecture. I said to them, the reason why I applied to be a culture leader for the cluster hub is because for me, culture is the heartbeat of every institution. And for an institution to be excellent, the culture of that institution has to be profound. And for me, the culture cluster as the heartbeat, I believe that it is very important that we deal with topics that are controversial. Our institution, because it is our heritage, it will be written UKZN. And for us, it is very important, extremely important. So then I shared the vision with the then acting dean, Professor Surya, and he gave me a thumbs up. And also the wonderful dean that we have, Professor Ojong, also blessed this public lecture. And I want to say to you, we have in this cluster powerful academics who are very assertive, innovative. That is why today we are here, because these topics that we deal with, and even in the future, they are controversial, they need strong hearts. So as the heart of the university, as a cluster, I have Dr. Nzuza, Dr. Pofolo, Dr. Gumede, Dr. Zondi, Dr. Geraldine, Associate Professor Ndlovu. I have Professor Marshall, I have Prof. Mahesh, and our acting dean. The aim of these public lectures is to focus on issues that we as the culture cluster perceive as impacting on the ethos of the university, ecology, deals with culture we have within it. And it talks about, was last year. And in that first series, we spoke about making UKZN a heritage. And we focus on decolonial lens. We felt as a cluster that for us to be able to go forward, it is very important to call students. We had a person of the caliber of Mr. Stova, who is the ex-president of AJUT, SRC AJUT, and Mr. Stova responded on behalf of the students to tell us about how do they want UKZN to look like as a heritage from a decolonial lens. We had, on behalf of the staff, we had Mr. Pakis, he's the president of the biggest union, staff union at UKZN, the UKSU. And he spoke on behalf of the staff. And we had Professor Mahesh, who focused on the infrastructure, the buildings, and said, this is how UKZ has to look like. If we want it to be a heritage, if we want it to be in a decolonial manner. But what was important was the critical speaker, who was our guest speaker. We had our humanities DVC, Professor Mkize, who was our guest speaker that time. So this year, we looked at our university. And as a team, we said, the way things are in terms of student protests, it is as if now they are becoming a culture, of which the reputation of our university is very important. And since it is very important, it is an asset for the whole nation. And as a university, we are also accountable to the public. So we said as a team, let us now focus on the student protests that are becoming violent. We agree that protests are important, but the violence behind is very important. And also our problem as a team, as the heartbeat of the university, we felt that these strikes now are becoming like, it is like an introduction to every term. Every term when we start, even before the term starts, there are protests. And we felt that let us sit and discuss about this. We believe that today, since it is this important webinar, we believe that at the end of this webinar, the violent protests will stop. And we pray and believe that students will start understanding that the heritage has to be kept alive. Burning cars, staff cars, burning university property. These affect even the finances, even the poor students that they are fighting for. Unfortunately, we end up losing money and not being able to assist. Hence, we call today a powerful man, Mr. Mguni, who is a student, to come and tell us about their perspective about how can we preserve this heritage of ours. And Professor Zulu, who is also, I'll say, an alumni, and also a staff member, in a way, to respond to Mr. Zulu, as someone who is supposed to assist us to preserve this heritage. He has experience. And to our two speakers, I want to say thank you. You will be thanked. But as a culture cluster and the social science school, we have 2 certificates for you. I am sending it on behalf of our school, social science, and on behalf of the culture cluster. We are also going to organize something like lunch for you, and we'll give you your tokens of appreciation. We salute you and we love you. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Harimasondo, for such encouraging words. And it is good to hear that the things that we say when we answer questions in an interview, we do not only say them for the sake of saying them, but we act on them. And like Dr. Hari Masondo has indicated, that what she is doing today, this public lecture, is one of the things that she said she will do in her tenure as the academic or cluster leader of culture cluster. From you, Dr. Hari Masondo, I must say that we are learning a lot. My UKZN, my heritage, or why are you banning our heritage? Or my UKZN, my heritage. Thank you. May I then move on with our program, whereby, I will be introducing our guest speakers as well as the facilitator. I am going to start with Professor Zulu. Professor Zulu, please pardon me. Unfortunately, I'm not going to say almost everything that has been said about you, but I'm just to say briefly who Professor Zulu is. Professor Zulu holds a PhD in social sciences from the University of Natal. Professor Zulu has published extensively in national and international publications, particularly in political philosophy and political economy. He has carried out important national and international assignments, including chairing Commission of Inquiry into issues affecting the state and social relations amongst South Africans. Presently, Professor Zulu is Professor Emeritus and Maurice Webb Fellow in the School of Social Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. May I then move on to present our other guest of honor, which is Mr. Lukhona Nguni. Mr. Lukhona Nguni holds a Bachelor of Community and Development Studies, which he obtained with cum laude, and an honors degree in conflict transformation and peace studies, which was also obtained with cum laude, which were both obtained from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Mr. Nguni holds a Master of Social Sciences in Africa and International Development from the University of Edinburgh, which he obtained in 2015. And he is currently serving as a PhD intern researcher in the Maurice Webb Race Relations Unit, and is a lecturer in the School of Social Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. Moving on to introduce our own Professor Mahesh Naidu, who is our facilitator today. Professor Mahesh Naidu is the academic and the Professor of Anthropology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and in the School of Social Sciences. She is a renowned researcher in various areas, which amongst others include gender studies, medical anthropology, and others. And with that being said, may I take this opportunity and hand over to our own Professor Zulu to give us the words of wisdom. Thank you.
Greetings, everybody. So I believe in a flat hierarchy, so I greet everybody and greet everyone equally. Let me jump straight into it. Across history, protest has shaped societies in truly remarkable ways and has often catalyzed monumental change. In the arc of many nations' history, the young have often played revolutionary roles. And if indeed in history can be viewed as a process, a dialectical process, an intelligible process moving towards a specific condition, and if that condition is human freedom, then the young have rightly a role to play in this change. And often students have been both the catalysts and the agents of this movement and change, often marshalling what I would call a necessary anger and organizing around the power of a righteous anger. So there have been student protests that have made the world stop and made the world take notice. After all, who can forget, who dares forget the Greensboro Four in 1960, when 4 young students in North Carolina who staged a sit-in at a whites-only Woolworths lunch counter. We all know that their protest against segregation inspired, galvanized hundreds of other student protests across USA. Who can forget, actually who dares forget, the protest led by our own Black students in Soweto in 1976. About 20,000 students protested in response to the Afrikaans language requirements, a language closely associated with white oppression. And an estimated 176 protesters were brutally killed. This horrific tragedy, of course, sparked anti-apartheid movements across the globe. And of course, who can forget on 9th of March 2015, when a student hurled that piece of feces, which has now become an incredibly famous piece of feces, at the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, and in turn inspired the most significant period of student protest in post-apartheid South African history. In the words of Ugandan scholar Mamdani, students can and have acted as a catalytic force with power to spur other groups into action and political change. The fees must fall protests of 2015 and 2016 left an indelible mark on higher education in South Africa. The protests left absolutely no university untouched, and of course, touched our university as well. And they elicited significant emotions for, against, and a mixture of the two. So throughout history, student protests have become a staple for social change. Now, many of us believe in the argument for the university as a space for this kind of citizenship education, which can, if and when needed, catalyze a groundswell moment of activism. Many of us believe that there is a fundamental responsibility that universities have in the development of this kind of conscious citizen, in this kind of conscious citizenship. That said, why are we here instead of having lunch? Why do we have this particular theme for conversation today? Well, over and above what the other speakers have shared, I believe it's because amidst and amongst other artifacts, and amidst and amongst other kinds of heritage, is the value of creating a body of students as citizens and as our real human capital, our real heritage. And let it not be the case that the only lesson history teaches us is that nobody ever learns anything from history. So what can we learn? And I agree with the previous speakers, this is not a pretty or a pleasant or a popular conversation to have, but it is a very necessary one. Many of us on each side can attest that on the part of the students, there have been instances of intimidation, unruly chants, desecration of property, setting cars alight, setting buildings alight. But there's also been dialogue and there's been negotiation. On the part of institutions, there have been instances of militancy, tear gas, rubber bullets, incarceration, but there's also been dialogue and negotiation. So how can we work together to support the palimpsest of identities of the students? Students as political leaders in university governance, students as citizens with rights, as activists, as our intellectual clients that we have an ethical and moral obligation to, and as students as pedagogic beings across the different spaces of the university. What is the role and place of student protest here? And when does student protest or any protest move from righteous anger and righteous dissent to wanton destruction? Well, we hope that our speakers will take us through these and many other questions and answers. And without further ado, I want to move us to our first speaker, Mr. Lukhona Mnguni, who is going to launch us into this very important conversation. Over to you, Lukhona.
Thank you, Professor Naidu, for that eloquent introduction to our conversation. I'd just like to request Shakila to put up the presentation. Thank you, Dr. Khademasondo, for your invitation to execute what is arguably a very difficult task. You've given me the duty to operate. I hope I have the right PPE in terms of today's language, and I have the correct surgical gloves to conduct this work. I want to start off this conversation on my UKZN, my heritage, the efficacy of student protests, by doing a simple background check on the institution that we call a university. The European University has its roots in the city of, some will say Bologna in Italy, but the Italians say Bologna. And the University of Bologna was founded in 1088. At least that is the prevailing consensus among those who have tried to discover when this university was founded. So in the late 11th century. And this university was founded by students, an organized guild of students for students. And Roderick Long gives an interesting exposition on this university in his paper entitled A University Built by the Invisible Hand. And Long contends that the University of Bologna was run from the bottom up, controlled by students and funded by students. This was a bottom-up approach, unlike the top-down approach at the University of Paris at the time of its founding, because that university was founded, organized, and funded by the government with students under strict guardianship of faculty. And the students, so the students who came together into an association that led to the University of Bologna, which is the first recognized university in Europe, were foreign nationals in the city. And at the time, the city had laws that entailed collective punishment. If an English national who committed a transgression skipped the city, any other English citizen could be held accountable for the transgressions of the now fugitive citizen. So we can therefore conclude that the formation of the university itself was a form of protest against these city bylaws. And the foreign students, according to Long, and I quote, therefore began to band together for mutual insurance and protection into associations called nations, according to their various nationalities. One nation would be composed of all English students, another of all French students, and so on. If any student needed assistance, such as paying other people's debts as demanded by the government, the other members of his nation would chip in to help. Each was willing to pledge a contribution to the group for this purpose, in exchange for the assurance that he himself would be able to draw on these pooled resources in time of need. And I close that quote. So as these associations of students grew, their interconnectedness increased. The students joined the nations into a universitas. At the time, not a university, but a corporation that brought students together. Through this universitas, the students could bargain with the city council for better rules towards them. The students had become powerful because they had resources, their fees. They used this as their bargaining chip. If the students who were foreigners left the city, there was the risk of the professors also following suit. So now these students had formed themselves into a community and they were hiring the professors. And so students, even back then in the 11th century, used protest against the city through negotiation and at times threatening strikes to force concessions. The professors, on the other hand, were not to have their way either. If they did not start or end a lecture on time, they were fined by the students. So students could also hire and fire the professors. Effectively, students called the shots with the tools to punish professors by boycotting lectures or withholding fees. This informs us that the oldest university in Europe at its founding was governed by students, with the universitas, an entity of authority and administration run by students. However, the professors were not part of the universitas. Only students were members, and it was run democratically. The universitas graduated into a university, a student-run university. The professors also formed their own association, the College of Teachers. Through this college, professors could bargain with students, determining their examination fees and course requirements. Thus, a power-sharing arrangement ensued, co-governance of the University of Bologna. This ended when the city decided to directly pay the professors with taxpayers' money, curtailing the power of students. One can only imagine that following this expropriation of power, students were left with lobbying, consultation, and protest to make their demands. We shall return to this issue. Another exposition of the University of Bologna is by David Lyons, who writes a book chapter entitled The University and the City, Cultural Interactions. And Lyons traces the coexistence of three main institutions in the city of Bologna at the time: the church, the commune, and the university, or called studium. The University of Bologna introduced a new sphere in the makeup of society in that town, a space of structured learning fighting for its independence from the church so as not to focus merely on ecclesiastical teachings. Initially, the institution offered courses in law, medicine, and the arts. The church remained quite influential in the affairs of the university. It seems the university's first chancellor was in fact appointed through the papacy of Honorius III in 1219, in the form of the then cathedral's archdeacon. Once more, the papacy intervened in 1291, granting Bologna's graduates licentia ubique docendi, the privilege of teaching anywhere in Christendom, and thereby recognizing the university as a studium generale. The development of the university was marred in politics and religion. Perhaps in the present day, the former, which is politics, continues to bedevil the development of the university. As the University of Bologna was contending with its formation and transmutation, another university was being formed in Europe, the University of Oxford. No exact date of formation exists, but there is some indication that teaching began in 1096, and this rapidly developed in 1167, when King Henry II issued a directive for English students not to attend the University of Paris. Now at Oxford, it was the masters, the professors, who were recognized as the universitas in 1231. During this 13th century, clashes ensued between the townspeople and the students in Oxford. Perhaps the equivalent of such clashes on our land would be that between Amaqaba namaqoboka or Amabhinqa nezifundiswa, because as people were being converted to Christianity and starting school, they would clash with the locals who were resisting such conversion. These clashes in the city of Oxford led to the establishment of halls of residence. Today we refer to this as the college system. Added to this, the clashes at Oxford led to the formation of the University of Cambridge in 1209. Students fleeing the rioting in Oxford congregated at the Roman trading post of Cambridge for purposes of study. Legend has it that 2 students at Oxford were hanged following a conviction on a single manslaughter. The University of Oxford entered voluntary suspension following this incident. And I think here we learn that the university has always had an inclination towards activism through that act from the University of Oxford. In 1231, King Henry III granted a royal charter formally giving rights to the University of Cambridge. And in 1233, through a decree, Pope Gregory IX confirmed university status to Cambridge, giving legal protection to the chancellor and students. Once more, this depicted the proximity, influence, and command of the church and royal family over the university. The autonomy of the university was nowhere to be seen at the time. The university was also largely dominated by men. It was not until October 1920, that women were allowed to matriculate, meaning be admitted to become members of the university or to graduate from the University of Oxford. Now, this is significant because it is almost 800 years since the formation of the institution that women began to enjoy full equal admission rights with men at the University of Oxford. Thus, the university can be said to be a space whose founding roots were extremely patriarchal and exclusionary to women. These historic accounts of European and English universities are important because much of their etiquette, ethos, and ideology found expression in the formation of South African universities. So the University of KwaZulu-Natal, whom I'm here to surgically operate, has its roots at the Natal University College, founded in 1910 on our Pietermaritzburg campus. This establishment emerged out of a land-marked deed of transfer 391 of 1910, dated 4 April 1910. This was just over a month before the Union of South Africa, a pact between English and Dutch white people, came into effect. It was also exactly a month before King George V came into office as King of the United Kingdom, all its colonies and subordinate jurisdictions. The formation of the Natal University College coincided with a restive moment in our country, as 1910 was the precursor to the enactment of the 1913 Natives Land Act. This puts the historic origins of UKZN squarely at the door of heightened oppression, the making of landless natives who had become a problem for the minority white government that sought to dispossess, oppress, and render Black people subhuman. This socio-political context is vital as it implicates today's UKZN as standing tall on prime geographic spots owing to land dispossession that left the natives pariahs in their own land, as observed by Sol Plaatje. As we all know, UKZN is made up of 5 campuses. Each has its own unique place in history. It is impossible to exhaustively recount each campus's history, but an attempt is worthwhile if we seek to arrive at some understanding of present day's UKZN heritage. Let's take the Howard College campus, for example, because it is very curious to me. I call it a treasure trove that immortalizes memories of both World War I and World War II. The first building on this campus was the Howard College building. It was built after T.B. Davis bequeathed a substantial donation in the memory of his son, Howard, who had lost his life during World War I fighting at the Battle of Somme, France in 1916. T.B. Davis was of British origin, arriving in South Africa in 1899 without higher education. On arrival, he took up a stevedoring position in East London and eventually settled in Durban, where he made his wealth. He is said to have controlled the stevedoring business from Port Elizabeth Harbour to Dar es Salaam Harbour. However, losing Howard in 1916 was a turning point for Davis. He purposed much of his life towards philanthropy. The Howard College building is said to have been built on 50 acres of land, and its doors were opened in 1931. The deed of transfer 2465/1932 was registered on 29 October 1932. Both the Howard College building and the Memorial Tower building are said to be situated on the remainder of Lot H of Subdivision 10 of the Farm Katomena 812 in the borough of Durban, province of Natal. It appears Farm Katomena 812 encompassed a vast area spanning from Howard College campus right into Westville, past the Pavilion Shopping Mall. We learn of this farm, Katomena 812, when we look at restitution cases, land restitution cases, involving the Gounden and Pillay families, heard at the Durban Land Claims Court in 2003 and 2004, respectively. Their cases stemmed from the fact that Indian properties in the Katomena area and adjoining properties were in June 1958 declared white group areas. There is no doubt then that the Howard College campus stands on dispossessed land, hence some prefer calling the area a Tusini. It is a form of reclamation, a type of protest. Before I digress, let us return to the buildings. The Memorial Tower building was built between 1948 and 1972 to commemorate students who had died during World War II. And that is why when you enter the Memorial Tower building, on its flank, on the flanks of the main sliding door, you will see a list of white males. In 1986, the building was declared a national monument. As the MTB's construction was concluding, another building was being planned and initiated, the Dennis Shapstein building. But who was Dennis Shapstein? He was the grandson of Sir Theophilus Shapstein Usomteu. Dennis was the first chancellor of the University of Natal, serving from 1949 until his death in 1966. He was also the administrator of Natal in the first 10 years of apartheid rule, 1948 to 1958. And his grandfather had risen, of course, to native administration in Natal around 1845. This indicates a century-long influence of the Shapsteins on the domination, control, and direction of natives in Natal. Then one can imagine that the Natal University College was not beyond racial segregation, even though its founding legislation did not explicitly make for racial exclusion. The university did decline applications from Black students. The Durban campus of the Natal University College was established in 1922 at the Natal Technical College. Racial exclusionary practices were only challenged in the 1930s by Mabel Palmer. One of our residences in the Howard College is named after her. And Mabel Palmer led this challenge on racial exclusionary practices, and a concession was granted to start a non-European section in 1936. And Palmer ran this section over weekends at Sastry College from 1936 to 1956 with the assistance of other staff members she recruited. Some well-known scholars who graduated from this section include Fatima Mir and Absalom Vilagazi. During this racially tumultuous period, Ernest Gideon Malhebe, E.G. Malhebe, one of our libraries is named after him, became principal and vice chancellor of the Natal University College from 1945 until 1965. Malhebe, though seen as an Afrikaner liberal, he favored what he called separate but equal education. For this reason, Malhebe campaigned for a black medical school at the university, and this was granted in 1947 with gates opening in 1951. It was also during this period that the university received its full independent status in 1949. The University of Natal was now in full swing with 3 campuses and a non-European section. The university's coat of arms were granted by the United Kingdom in 1957. Important to note in those coat of arms is the 5-pointed star from the old arms of the Natal University College, symbolizing the land of Natal, discovered and named on Christmas Day, 1497. The motto of the university became Stella Aurorae, meaning star of the dawn or star of the rising sun, symbolizing the role of the university in dispelling the darkness of ignorance and evil and standing forever on the threshold of the brightening day. So what do we learn from this? Effectively, while the university sought independence, its imagery and ethos had continuities of the socio-political realities happening outside the gates of the institution. This is important to note, as it means the collective heritage of the university at the time was not beyond the politics of colonialism, imperialism, and bastardization of Black people as heathen, barbaric, subhuman, and landless. I will not dwell too much on the history of the other two campuses that make up UKZN. The Westville campus, used to be the University of Durban Westville, opened in 1972 to replace the University College for Indians, which was established in 1961 at Salisbury Island. You needed a ferry to access these facilities. It is well documented that UDW went on to be a melting pot of political activism against apartheid. Equally, the same was happening at the medical school. Well, for obvious reasons. When you bring oppressed people into a common space, they are bound to be agitated and organized for their liberation. This ignited a flurry of protests in various forms as the university became a site of struggle for the emancipation from socio-political brutality that generally took place beyond the gates of the institution. Therefore, we can argue that the university has always been a site of struggle because it is a microcosm of society. The university cannot be divorced from the injustices permeated on society outside its gates. Of course, at the University of Natal, you also had the likes of Rick Tanner, who took the baton from Mabel Palmer's generation to fight against racist laws. The Edgewood campus used to be the Edgewood College of Education, designated for white students. It was not until 1994 that this college could take in students from other racial groups. The college was incorporated into the University of Natal in 2001. Effectively, at the time of the 2004 merger, the University of Natal was comprised of 4 campuses, and it was then merged with the University of Durban Westville. Perhaps this explains the name University of KwaZulu-Natal. It appears a mere integration of KwaZulu, that name symbolizing the marginalized, cast into a Bantustan of underdevelopment and stunted opportunities. And that periphery was being merged into the University of Natal. There seems to have been no deep thinking about creating a new institution, both in name and ethos. Again, the naming of the institution appears an extension of the prevailing provincial politics at the time. The merger was mechanical and less substantive. Hence, UKZN had to date struggled to pin down, or has to date struggled to pin down a governing culture, an identifiable system of values, and distinct pedagogical tools that make it truly aligned to its founding vision towards African scholarship. Today's topic calls upon us to proudly proclaim my UKZN, my heritage, with a sense of pride. I have undertaken this historical review of the institution called a university and the specific history of the University of KwaZulu-Natal in order for us to interrogate what we mean by UKZN heritage, whether this heritage is to be celebrated or rethought or at times even be denounced. However, it might be important to put the meaning of heritage in context. Let us look at the concept of the heritage cycle diagram. The diagram, according to Simon Theli, gives us an idea how we can make the past part of our future. It reads, by understanding cultural heritage, people value it. By valuing it, people want to care for it. By caring for it, it will help people enjoy it. And from enjoying it comes a thirst to understand. And by understanding, then the cycle continues itself. However, it is also important to be reminded in our understanding that heritage, according to John Feather, is a human creation intended to inform, close quote. A human creation intended to inform. Probably some would then say this suggests heritage is a social construct. Two things become important. The people who have the power to curate heritage through choosing what aspects of history are translated into heritage and which parts are not, needs us to pay attention to. The second important thing is how some people are trying to inform future generations. Put simply, what consciousness do they wish to build in the minds of future generations through the heritage they have selected to educate future generations on and about? It follows then that not all history is heritage. History that becomes heritage depends on those who curate the history into heritage. It must then follow that unlike family or community heritage, institutional heritage is highly contested. Worse still when dealing with universities. It was Ali Mazrui between 1978 and 1980 who described, and I quote, the African universities of the time primarily as institutions for the promotion of Western civilization, close quote. For Mazrui, the post-independence African university needed indigenization in order to be rooted in the African experience. Today, we talk about the need for decolonization of higher education, including the spaces that house this education. These calls are lamentations that decry the overarching dominance of Western civilization in our institutions, because that dominance denies African students and scholars the ability to exist and express their identity in fullness. The identity of Africans is subordinate or at worst rejected by Western civilization, because Africans needed to be civilized by Westerners according to the colonial logics. That rejection of African civilization continues to permeate in the curriculum we teach, the research subjects we undertake, and the rubric we adhere to for international rankings. The African civilization is deemed null and void. A rebellion against Western civilization quickly gets denounced as uncouth and as uncultured conduct. It is termed ungrateful behavior for the opportunities, because you are told by merely being in this space, you should be grateful of that opportunity. Or at times, this rebellion against Western civilization leads to institutional castration, rendering those who rebel persona non grata in the hallways of higher education. Those who embrace the language of transformation and decolonization, some of them do so for public political mileage, while in private, they suppress efforts for transformation. This turncoat behavior by some, particularly those who are tasked with managing these institutions, has led to stunted institutional outcome, and it breeds frustration among those who are at the most brutal part of the receiving end of the dominance of Western civilization. Even academics are aware of this, especially those whose research interests find no resonance with their colleagues, with journals for publication, and in the era of publish or perish, the academic is forced to abandon their true intellectual calling in order to fit in. Having fought the system and failed, this academic goes on to dispirit students who agitate for change in service of the need to fit in. Here, the students' intellectual aspirations are dumbed down and drowned by the pervasive Western civilization. The student in this instance is turned into a different being, but one they can never be, and a part of them is stripped away. The student becomes an embodiment of competing intellectual and heritage forces, rendering him or her an incomplete being. This sparks an identity crisis in the student. When a critical mass of students could identify with this identity crisis, it prompted them into action to call for the decolonization of higher education. Nationwide protests were seen. They resonated with many in society. Beyond decolonization, they called for free quality education. This too resonated with many people, given our wealth disparities and how many deserving people miss out on opportunities simply because of their poor backgrounds. The problem came when criminal and violent elements accompanied the student protests. Uninspired by this violence, people began to denounce the protests and the student body as a whole. I wish to say this was a cardinal mistake. Disagreement with protest repertoire does not invalidate the demands that led to protest to begin with. Let us return to the words of the first Chancellor of UKZN, Umama Frene Jinwala, who was also the first Speaker of the democratically elected National Assembly. At her installation as Chancellor, she noted that, and I quote, "All South African institutions face specific difficulties in overcoming the legacies of the past and meeting the challenges of the future," close quote. Some of those legacies of the past have been framed and given prominent place as part of our institutional heritage. How can we overcome the legacies of the past if each time you walk up the stairs to the Howard College building, you must involuntarily acknowledge King George V, because his statue is in such a position that you must walk around it. You can't ignore it. Is that symbolic or petty obsession with symbols and artifacts that remind us who our university forefathers are? those forefathers who came to civilize us because our ancestors were living in the dark? How do we venerate our ancestors, even sing them in our clan names, while at the same time celebrating those who oppressed and dispossessed them of their humanity? Does this incompatible competition of heritage on our bodies not create an identity crisis, which could even lead to cognitive dissonance, harmful to the well-being of our society? In that same address, uMamofrene Ginwala stated that, and I quote, "All institutions need to question their inheritance. All institutions need to question their inheritance." She was correct. How do we interpret our inheritance as UKZN? How much of it have we questioned? Upon doing so, what have we done with the responses we have received from those questions we have asked? I wish to posit that our inheritance is one of an institution whose foundation was constructed at a time the African was an invisible, bastardized person. How has the ethos, conduct, and practice of the institution transformed to give the African life, dignity, compassion, and humanity? The students we see, the student protests we see play out in an environment of these unanswered questions, where there is no consensus on what heritage should make up our institution. When the pioneers of the UKZN merger set out on their task, they sought to build the premier university of African scholarship. In the 10 years that I have been at UKZN, I have asked many people, from students to academics to management, what this aspiration means to be a premier university of African scholarship. Some do not know. Others have an idea, but it seems none have a clear articulation in thought and in action what this means. We still desire affirmation of the university from a Western lens. Hence, we glorify international rankings. We still desire the meaning of the university to flow from the Magna Carta Universitatum that was initially signed in 1988 exclusively by rectors of European universities gathered in Bologna for the 9th centenary of the oldest university in Europe. UKZN became a signatory to the Magna Carta. And one of the principles it signed up for were, and I quote, relevant teaching and research, and to attain full universal knowledge, close quote. I must ask, who defines universal knowledge? How does an institution with aspirations to be the premier of African scholarship identify with aspirations of universal knowledge? What are the dangers of such aspiration? Do such aspirations not negate some experiences, misrepresent some people, and alienate certain knowledge producers? Is the African experience part of the universalization project? I digress, but these questions need significant exploration, and I believe they are what we might term epistemological questions and what Professor Zulu might term sociology of knowledge questions. Let me spend some time as I go to my closing on what makes any form of protest effective. Perhaps a passing comment is that protest gives voice to the marginalized, oppressed, and downtrodden people. This is why even our democratic institution our democratic constitution protects protest as a right, because there is understanding that those who are in power can become tone deaf and need to be shaken from their slumber through protest. But all protests share some assumptions. Firstly, those who are in power, the first assumption is that those who are in power have a conscience and moral fiber that allows them to be convinced differently. The second assumption is that those in power are able to rise to the negotiation table and forgo their beliefs at times. Thirdly, those in power are willing, able, and capable to deliver on their promises. So protest outcomes depend on how those in power respond. The political opportunity conceptual framework teaches us that when those in power respond in repressive ways, the protesters are likely to view this as diminishing political opportunity for their demands to succeed, and they then resort to violence to force the hand of those in power or to self-protect from the repression meted out by those in power to them. Therefore, the efficacy of student protests cannot be examined in isolation to the responses of those who are in power to which the protest action is directed. As canvassed earlier, not all protest on the university grounds is about the conduct of university management. At times, it is directed to powers in government. However, it is important for university management to understand this distinction and have dynamic responses to different issues being raised. Given that the university is a space of learning, it is bound to be a place where people's consciousness and activism is fostered in significant ways. This means protest in the university space is inevitable and permanent. The issue is how that protest is conducted. And this, I propose, is intricately linked to how power responds to protest. However, for people to value both the tangible and intangible heritage of an institution, they must resonate with that heritage. It cannot be pronounced automatically that my UKZN, my heritage, because as I have traversed the institutional history of UKZN, it is evident that its history represents people in differentiated ways. UKZN has an inheritance we must question, with the need to leap into a future unhindered by historical baggage. The historical, cultural, socio-political foundation of the institution was embedded on an antithesis of the democratic South Africa we are building. The work to repurpose this institution requires leadership that is selfless, visionary, and seeks no gratification from those who would wish to see their heritage of Dennis Shapstein, T.B. Davis, World War II undisturbed. To build the UKZN that many can easily pronounce, my UKZN, my heritage, demands a clear articulation and commitment to the future institution we wish to build. For this to be done, a clear collision course must be created between acquiescing to the demands of universal knowledge making, and the need for decolonization in our institutions of higher learning. You cannot achieve both, and least not at the transition phase. You also cannot have students who take pride in the institutional heritage when our curriculum does not allow them to encounter the teachings of the Black consciousness movement in their first year. because Black consciousness was important, because it taught one self-love. It then sought to infuse the Black person with pride in the quest of restoring his or her dignity, at least psychologically, if not yet materialistically. Today, some of our students encounter Black consciousness outside the classroom, but they are definitely going to encounter Karl Marx and Marxism in the classroom. Of course, some academics are illiterate on these knowledge areas of Black consciousness, and they feel inadequate when called upon to teach these concepts in affirming ways, not in their critique. This is why some academics rebel against the concepts of decolonization. They use the fear of dumbing down the system as a reason to cover up for their own illiteracy on the demands of decolonization, because if they are illiterate, then their doctoral degrees and professorships become redundant and irrelevant. Instead, we have a teaching and learning ethos that induces cognitive dissonance in our learners, while teaching them in an environment whose memorabilia alienates them. Transgressive pedagogies are viewed a risk and not the norm. Part of our heritage as African people is oral history, which has forced those in the business of preserving heritage to recognize the importance of intangible heritage. Yet in our teaching and learning, we have no methods of tapping into this strength of African communities' oral history. We still find it difficult to assess students using oral methods, even when we can tell during consultations that they articulate better in spoken word than written form. We have to think broadly what it means to build an institution that aspires to be a premier of African scholarship. We must be unrelenting in this demand, but we must do the necessary intellectual spade work to define it, learning from Mazrui that it is to first and foremost stop UKZN from being an agent of the promotion of Western civilization. It is for this reason that UKZN ought to even interrogate its tagline, inspiring greatness. Greatness in what? Greatness from which setting and in service of what socio-political forces? This is because it is now self-evident that the university is not and cannot be autonomous of the socio-political and socio-cultural moment within which it exists. I hope I have raised enough questions to continue the discussion on what UKZN heritage is, while at the same time giving caution and guidance on how power should respond to protest, with the view of taking a holistic approach in unpacking some of the institutional challenges we confront. We also need a rethinking of curriculum and pedagogies in order to infuse self-love to students while heightening their consciousness and giving them space for activism that constructively contributes to the future of our institution. Because if the students and all those who are in the UKZN space don't have a consciousness of self-love, then it becomes impossible for them to show appreciation and love to the UKZN heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lakona. Thank you very much for those words. And I broke my own rule here by not interrupting you when you were going over time, because you were just beginning to get into the trenches, and I didn't want to interrupt you because right at the end you were raising thoughts that we needed to hear. We needed to hear those provocations so that we could provoke you back. But without further ado, let me move to the respondent, Professor Zulu, who's already been introduced to you. Let us hear from him. But can I invite the listeners to continue to post questions and comments so we can more robustly engage with both the speakers as soon as Professor Zulu is done. Thank you. Professor Zulu, over to you.
Thank you, very much, Lokona, for a very challenging, erudite, and very complex presentation, I must say. It touches on a number of issues, and I think that's where the complexity arises from. There are issues of affection, that's the heritage aspect, and identity. And yet there are also functional issues, which I shall call pragmatic issues. And going together with these complexities is the issue of the reaction of the students in the way that they have responded to the issues, which are not necessarily inherent in universities, but in a number of instances, some of them are inherent in the social and political and economic system, and therefore go beyond the university. Starting with the issue of heritage, I do sympathize with your presentation. The ambiguity that arises out of being immersed in an implanted institution. Because in a way, organized schooling, going to organized university schooling, are in a sense implanted, particularly on this part of the continent. Universities and schools probably are or were common in North Africa, in the Mediterranean region, but I do not recall anything in Southern Africa. So schooling and universities probably became implanted with the colonial culture and the colonial heritage. I'm not going to go and examine the motives. They were not necessarily intended to upgrade the levels, if I use the term upgrade in inverted commas, of the indigenous or locals, but they were to make the colonial experience much more viable. However, there are a number of issues that arise in how a university and the student body, or a university as a whole, responds to this dilemma or conundrum. I don't think one can out or de-Oxford the University of Natal. In other words, if it was built along the lines of the ex-Oxford or Cambridge or whatever experience, I don't think it's possible to undo that, because there are already facts that live with us. The university came in a particular form, and if the form was the faculty, the hierarchical arrangements, who makes the decisions, etc., those were given when the university came about. The issue is actually, how do we react? Because an institution that already exists, you can only react to it and modify it, and what we refer to as transformation. And I think what I shall try and dwell upon is the integrity and the honesty in the transformation process. Because if we want to go anywhere, we have to go via that particular route. How do we, I do not want to use the word decolonize because I do not find it very honest. I do not know how you remove Howard or King George at the entrance of Howard College and leave the Howard College building intact because they are both colonial heritages. Nor would it be pragmatic to destroy the buildings and everything in the university and start afresh. So we're going to a process of selective whatever word we want to call it. It becomes, in other words, we go back to what Lukona refers to as heritage being a social construction, as a selective process where you select what you want and leave out what you do not want. Going together with that will be power, ideology, convenience, and all the other things. It becomes a very complex process. In other words, it's very difficult to respond to this paper because it has a number of compartments that, and to decompartmentalize it also does not create a whole. Now, let me try and respond to some of the most salient issues. If we are to create a new heritage, our heritage, then we need a very, very big conference. By a conference, I do not mean just organizing a conference. I mean a continuous process of selectivity. What is it that we want to keep? What is it that we want to throw away? Generally, protests have not been on the issues of the heritage. They have been spontaneous responses or reactions. Protests, probably the weaknesses of the protest is their reactive nature. Because then that creates discontinuities. Each protest becomes separate from the other protest or the previous protest, and it does not necessarily become a prelude to new protests, to future protests. Now, what has been the weakness of this? Probably the complexity of the situation has been the main weakness of the protest. And I do not think that denouncing protests has been a cardinal mistake. Personally, I do not think so. A university is a place of learning, and it is a place where one expects rationality. And rationality entails a proper canvassing, examination, and exploration of the terrain in which one operates, which therefore also leads one to anticipate what are the most likely consequences of that. And denouncers of protests have always been disappointed at this inability to foresee and forestall what are the most likely consequences. And the reaction therefore becomes violent, strange elements which enter the protest arena, but they should have been anticipated in a properly planned area. The second issue that has been a major, mind you, I must start by saying, I do not, in principle, oppose protest. I think if there were no protest, there would be no change. It is the modality. And why the modality in particular? From an institution expected to be the center of reason, and students are budding reasoners or reasoners in the making. Take, for instance, the issue of the fees must fall. I supported it fully. And I think any person who wants change and who wants progress in a country would have done the same. I was disappointed at the absence of articulated alternatives. Fees must fall is abstract. In other words, do not pay fees. Where you get the money from and how you restructure the economy of the country to enable, or how you restructure the fiscus to enable the fees to flow and not be paid becomes a second issue and a very difficult issue. Students gained, to a certain extent, the country has not gained, because the monsters that brought about the inequalities in the distribution of the fiscus still remain. I would have loved students to have given alternative scenarios and say, if you remove institutions of A, B, and C, there would be sufficient money to flow into education and the fees would fall. This did not happen. We still have all the other structures intact and the other institutions intact, which drain money from the fiscus. I'm not saying that was the duty of the students, but they had already said, we want a cake, a slice from the cake, and this is the part that you are going to cut away from. And this is what I call appropriate and intellectual, rational, reasoned planning. There are also certain problems with the way we sloganize until slogans become substantive or they lead the substance. Universal knowledge versus what is universal knowledge? I don't think it is a very difficult concept. It just says that knowledge which is useful for the upliftment, development of society. And it is going to vary with the exigencies in that particular society. I do not, the problem is once we start making these issues slogans, then they have their own momentum. And in the final analysis, we throw out the babies with the bathwater most of the time. Thanks goodness, reality at times brings us back. I honestly do not know how a university would be structured without some of the old, if you want to call them colonial relics. I mean, the buildings, the faculties, the management, and the other things are more or less universal across any institution. What differs is the modality, how you utilize those things. I'm not sure if I agree with Masrui, to be honest. I respect him a lot, but I think at times it became too patriotic. That's my point. And let's leave it at that. Now, what I want to address, because first of all, this is a very complicated topic, and we need to take it piece by piece and say, what do you do with the X? What do you do with the heritage? It's a very difficult question. How do you deal with the present issues? How do you take the present issues forward? How do you transform? There are three aspects that have affected the transformation agenda. It's the violence versus orderliness. Whether orderliness makes things better is another story, but it is the integrity of the transformation process. And that's what I want to dwell upon. If we want to deal with transformation, then we have to be people of serious integrity and say, what is it that we transform? Not the transformation of expedience. Literally, while emotional status and the other things might be important, I honestly think that that was the transformation of expedience. The second thing is the modality of transformation. How do we carry the transformation agenda forward? What modalities do we use? I do sympathize with the fact that at times modalities, which I refer to as the expediencies, are brought about by circumstances. You can't pay your fees, and therefore the concentration is on the fees. but we lose track of the other issues, the long-term issues. You have already burned down your hostel. Where do you go to tomorrow? You have already burnt down your library, which I consider to be criminal, because it is literally the very heritage that will tell you where you come from and where you were outdone and where you were badly handled and where you scored. And it is from this heritage that you can build a new heritage, and yet you destroy it. Now, I do not know, it's the mess that literally accompanies the transformation process that I find very difficult to live with. Again, as I say, going back to the heritage is going to be very difficult. You have to select what is it that you want to preserve, and what is it that literally is worth preserving, and what is it that you want to build anew, and how we are going to build it anew. My disappointment is there are very, very few instances. Lukona touches on the whole issue of Black consciousness and the curriculum, which I think I value greatly, not because it's Black consciousness, just the relevant curriculum and what it does to the people, to the identity, to the integrity, etc. But there are very few instances when protests have had the curriculum at all as an issue. It's the meals, it's the fees, it's the residences, it's all the other things that are material and not necessarily curriculum oriented. Of course, you have to get your curriculum from particular material arrangements. And I do not underplay them, but I'm saying there's been very little concentration by students on the transformation of the curriculum. And if you were to be honest, if you ask students what curriculum transformation mean, they would probably articulate it in terms of how well people pass when they take that particular course or subject, rather than the content and what it should do to them. I think we have to go back again as the university, an institution. If we are to be the African University of African Scholarship, then we have literally to define what that means. And I think Lukona raises here very, very serious issues. It's a slogan, to be honest. I'm not even sure whether we have a Department of African Studies or a Center of African Studies in the true sense of the word. We run towards like indigenous knowledge systems, etc., etc. And there that becomes also seriously a Humpty Dumpty concept. Whenever I use a word, it means exactly what I want it to mean. Yeah, in the final analysis, I should say, if we are to build a heritage, and there are elements of a heritage, there are certain things we are not going to remove. The universal things in a university, those are going to be very difficult to remove. I'm not sure about the Africanization part, on the indigenization part of them. I'm not even so sure whether we've completely or thoroughly defined and articulated what Africanization means, what indigenization means, to be honest with you. I think up to now we're still reactive. Right, let me rest my case there, and I'll answer the other things in the questions if they arise.
Thank you, Prof. Zulu. You've complicated my mind even further with your responses to Lukona, and I think you've managed to congratulate him on the points that he's provoked us to, while also picking at maybe some gaps that he failed to address, or where he appeared to cluster the arguments together. Lakona and Prof. Zulu, thank you very much. There are some questions here, and before I go to them, Lakona, thank you so much for your presentation. I completely agree with Prof. Zulu. So complex that one cannot respond to it in its entirety. You have to pull little threads that kind of jump out at us. And some of what you said sticks with me, and I resonate with some of the questions posted here. Your description of these buildings almost in male, well, they were described as male, as white, these bricks and mortar. And then tying that argument to heritage. Are buildings then white? Are they patriarchal? How do we respond to them? And I think I like Prof. Zulu's approach. Are we responding or are we reacting? And what exactly are we dismantling? Prof. Zulu's point again about if we take away the monument at the facade and retain the building, how selective are we being? Are we really reassembling our heritage? Or are we conveniently expediting certain aspects of a protest? I'm also interested to know how is it that the student protest is presented as a kind of monolithic singularity and a passage, when you know that there are kind of trajectories and fragmentations even within student protests and student approaches. The idea of modality, I was impressed by your use of the word repertoire. It seems like we have a particular, very narrow repertoire of protests, and that really, really pains me. And some of the questions that we'll come to reference that. A very particular approach within the protest. And you unpacked it in an interesting way. You said, protests escalate because there's resistance. So are we to understand that those escalations need to escalate to a violent point because there has not been a response that is demanded and expected? Who gets to decide, even amongst the students, what an adequate response would be from management, from leadership, from various structures? So I'm just sort of randomly pulling at some things that jumped out at me. I was interested in the notion of castration, and was wondering, the castration you spoke about is institutional castration against students, where institutions seem to be discounting protest. And I'm also empathetic to Prof. Zulu's position that is not necessarily the case. I don't think there is a groundswell against protest. It's common sense that without protest, status quo can't be questioned, change can't be effective. So it might be that there isn't a protest against protest, but it is, how do we enact this protest? And in this microcosm that you refer to as the university, are we saying then that the same kind of enactments must happen in the wider society? So there's a cluster of things here, much of it wrapped to identity, much of it wrapped to this constructed heritage. And what is the new heritage that we wish to construct? And I want to come back to, my starting point of how do we see ourselves, as students, as heritage? So it's beyond the bricks and mortar and the tangible. What about the intangible, human heritage? We seem to be moving away from that. And I'm interested to see how some of these questions are responded to. Let me go to one which also struck me as I listened to your journey through the paper, that your starting point was Oxford and Cambridge. And I understand that history is a dialectical process, and we need to start somewhere, not as the past, but because it is active within us even as we sit and speak today. But there is a comment question that asks, why would you start with, in a discussion of heritage of UKZN, why would you start it with Oxford and Italy and European universities and not look to other sources? Are we not doing other kinds of epistemic violences here by going to these starting points? What about universities in India, in Morocco, Timbuktu, Africa? So what was the reason behind starting in Oxford? We heard you that a lot of who we are and our management structures, our institutional ideologies may trace back. But I'm saying, why start there? It's almost as if we're giving power and privilege to that which we want to dissociate ourselves from. So Lukona and maybe Prof. Zulu can comment a little on that. There are very many other questions, but you could start us off on a response to why start with Oxford? Was it intentional?
Thank you, Mahesh. I've seen that comment question from Prof. Badat as well as from Bizo Bomela as well, and as you raise it, and I'm going to probably start my response there. It was very much intentional because when you look at, and hence I focused on the oldest university in Europe and not the oldest university in the world, because there is understanding that Al-Kakawisha in Morocco might have been the oldest establishment in terms of a center of learning and teaching. It's intentional because I was invited to discuss the heritage of UKZN. And while it is important to acknowledge pioneering institutions in Africa, I don't think we must do it for the sake of doing it. There are no continuities with those institutions and the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And I think sometimes this is the problem we commit when, and I don't think it's necessarily epistemic violence per se, but it is a problem that we commit when we embrace that which is African for the sake of embracing it as though there's homogeneity amongst Africans. Because as I started off, even the universities in Europe had a close association with the religious establishments at the time, particularly the Catholic Church. Even here in the African continent, if you go to Egypt, if you go to Morocco, if you go to Timbuktu, there was a great inclination of those institutions and marriage of those institutions with the Islamic faith and the practices that come in terms of culture and all other rituals that become part of the knowledge system and the learning. And sometimes the cultural heterogeneity of Africa makes it almost, while it is nice to acknowledge that, you know, Africa was not this dark continent, but where those institutions are does not necessarily find resonance nor continuities with our setting and where we are. So it was quite deliberate to start in Europe and start with European universities and also to start with a clear history on how students used to have some power historically in the institution that is called a university, and how that power has been expropriated by politicians in the city of Bologna, and then expropriated and handed over to professors and managers. And perhaps it could be that should be our starting point, because it's quite correct. There's what I always call, when I have conversation with Prof. Zulu, what I call irretrievable issues that you've lost because of colonialism. So there are things that pre-colonialism societies might have had, but colonialism decimated those, and it is impossible to retrieve them. So this is where even the question of language comes in, because I saw somebody raise the question of language. That can you decolonize while you are still using English as a medium of instruction? Of course you can, but I mean, it's also an embodiment of exactly where your society comes from. I don't think we can avoid it, but the reluctance of the bilingual policy that we have been trying at UKZN and how reluctant some people are towards that tells you that there is reluctance to transform into a new state of existence that pictures people differently and engages the human experience in various ways, because language is an important way of engaging the human experience. But I think that even using English, you can still be able to decolonize if you understand language, one, as a form of tools to communicate, whilst not absenting the mere fact that it is also a representation of identity, of cultures, and so on. But it's how you then position the usage of English as a medium rather than as a cultural tool. And those distinctions are important for me. But you then, I mean, talk about the institutional castration I talk about is not only about students, by the way, it's also for academics. I think we need to understand what we mean by protest. Where does protest begin? Because I said in various forms, because protest is not toy-toying. Toy-toying is a form of protest. When academics are trying to write papers that are disrupting in terms of how knowledge is produced, that are disruptive in terms of the pedagogies, they are in fact protesting. Take when we started with the online learning, and some academics were proposing social pedagogy to be used as an instruction methodology in a time of pandemic, in a time of emergency. And those academics were engaged in a protest. It might have been a petition form of protest. It might have been a knowledge protest, but it was a form of protest. So the problem is that we focus on the tail end of the protest. The protest happens inside the classroom when the student is in a collision course with an academic who is disrespectful of the student as a person, what some people will call the master-slave relationship of the classroom, where the academic wants to be a master and the students the slaves. And you get to hear students quoting various academics. I mean, not at UKZN, but in one institution. I mean, something very violent that academics would do, would come into a lecture and say, look to your left, look to your right, one of you will not be here next year. Look to your left, look to your right, two of you will not be here in final year. That is the type of violence. And then when students speak out against that dispiriting posture of the academic, they are then viewed as disrespectful. They are then reminded of their place, and the academic walks out of the classroom still a master who cannot be reprimanded. Now, this is very important because it then means at that initial point of protest, there is a winner, and that is the academic. And the student leaves that classroom setting still wanting to have their voice heard. Now, that's where then the toy-toying happens. But before, that's why we know before the toy-toying part of the protest, we already know there's going to be a protest, because as Prof. Zulu says, the grievances are there. And yes, the protest can appear spontaneous, but at times it is responding to issues that have been almost having a compounding effect on the people that are experiencing them. And of course, the bread and butter issues are going to be the first starting point, because how can you discuss curriculum if you do not know where you are going to sleep and you do not know what you are going to eat in the evening? It becomes a very, call it a luxurious exercise to discuss curriculum. But those, I'm trying to say, those who then have an interest on questions of curriculum, questions of pedagogy, questions of knowledge production, and even the ideas of how we publish and why we should publish the way we do, some of those people find themselves institutionally castrated between the
Lakona, I'm just going to ask you to hold up there. Lakona, thank you for that. You started off by saying that you know, protest can take many forms, and I was listening with excitement, but you ended off by coming back to the student as the recipient of violence. Your opening was that, you know, staff are also, and I quite agree, that the violence against people can take many forms, and protest can take many forms. I think what we are struggling with, and you've seen the question here, which is thanking you for your presentation, and says, I still can't understand why in moving forward there's destruction and violence. And that is something also that Prof. Zulu has come to. And let's cut to the chase. I think many people here are wanting to know the response from both the speakers. How do we feel about the violence? I think I'm still not satisfied with the response that because the grievance is not being heard, because the students are not demands are not being met, and perhaps demands is not the most appropriate word here, that this escalation to other forms of protest is necessary, is acceptable, is something that many people are struggling with, including the question here. This is the burning of buildings. What does it accomplish? If I have to ask you those bold kind of questions, what does that kind of protest accomplish? Does it not teach the protester that this is the only way to have a response, and a very particular kind of response as well? as agreement. So are we not simplifying this? Are we not truly understanding that there is much more to just having a demand met? So are we not building a particular set of particular narrow repertoire within this protest action? I think is something that many people would like to question. Prof. Zulu, go ahead.
Yeah, let me take that one. I think we have to go back. The way protest manifests, in a sense, becomes quote unquote cultural. And by cultural, I mean pervasive in a particular environment. In a sense, it's the easy way out of getting things the way one wants them to be. My bother is that in the first instance, the target generally is not the source of power or the source of capacity with regard to that particular issue over which there is protest. The university is generally a middleman, but a very easy target to reach, because the allocations are made higher up in government where the student can't reach. So in a sense, the university is held to ransom. It becomes like your hijacked child who literally is not in a position to extricate himself from the situation until the parent pays the ransom. That's the first thing. And I'm not so sure if students do go to the depth of the issue to know who actually they should target. Because for the very things that they protest against the university for, they could easily go to the nearest government office and do that, because that's where the funds come from. To me, what I find very problematic is the mercilessness in the protest behavior. It becomes mercy because at the very definition, there is a mercy, cloudy, not very clearly thought out process. Who is responsible? How is who is responsible? How can who is responsible be made responsible, and what the outcome should be? And that's why the whole issue, the whole protest becomes very messy. There are protests in other countries again. They don't culminate in the burning of buildings. They don't culminate in the burning of libraries. I honestly do not understand the South African protest. And I think this comes from the alienation and the absence of a reconstructive process post-1994. Before 1994, the rationale was it belongs to the Afrikaners. The buildings, the land, the everything, they took it, it's just we want it back. And even if we destroy it, they are going to have to rebuild it because they owe us. We are now into a new phase, and we are still behaving exactly as we behaved before 1994. I'm not saying that we're doing better after 1994, before we did in 1994. But I'm saying now that we have the capacity to sit on round tables and be known, we could actually present an alternative model to that which is happening. Let me just make an example. There are about 400 or 800 or how many councillors in South Africa, I do not know, municipal councillors. That's on top of the provincial governments. That's on top of the national legislature. So with the 400 plus national legislature, with X, I cannot count the number of provincial councils, I don't know. And then the municipal council. Now that's massive, massive sums of money. That do we need that many? We've never gone into that debate. And yet we have accounting, we have economics, we have planning, we have management, we have sociology, we have everything. And these are all thought-provoking disciplines which must be enabling students to think in a particular direction. And to me, that is why the protest becomes so messy, because they are contradictory in modality to the academic establishment. I'm not sure if I'm making myself understood.
Good. Thanks, Prof. I want to continue with you and then take the same question to Lukona. There's another question posted here, and I think it ties in with some of what you're saying. It says, how can we avoid my UKZN, my heritage, becoming a dangerously uncritical embrace of the history of UKZN, which has, like all other universities before 1994, ugly aspects to it: colonial, racial, patriarchal, ontological, Eurocentrical, all of that. What aspects does one then embrace, and what does one reject?
Lukona has just said there isn't a my heritage.
Would you agree with that? Do you agree with that?
Pardon?
Do you agree with that?
That there isn't my heritage? Oh, definitely, I do not think there is my heritage. I'm not even sure if there is a heritage, to be honest. There is some fuzzy, cloudy, contested something called a heritage, because some people want to call it that. But I don't think there is a heritage. Should
there be, Prof? Should there be a heritage?
Oh,
is that what we need to decolonize? And I hate that word as well.
Yeah, let me go to this. There are two very tenacious institutions which seem to have transcended all centuries: the family and the church or religion. To those who belong to those institutions, they are heritages. And they are heritages because they have passed from generation to generation, accepted normativities which govern those heritages, and belief systems in the sanctity and the permanence of those heritages. They will invoke ancestors in the family. They will invoke saints in the church. They will invoke prophets in some other religions, your Buddha, your Muhammad, etc., etc. They are heritages. I am not sure if we have that type of a heritage at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I was also wondering if it was, and I wanted to ask this from Lukona, if KwaZulu-Natal came from the KwaZulu Bantustan and the colonial past, or it was just a geographical name because they were contesting institutions. There was the University of Durban, Westville, there was the University of Natal, and each wanted to appear or to be recognized in the new formation. We who were at Natal, and because I lived through this, were just aghast at the disappearance of the University of Natal. I still refuse. Nobody should say I have a degree from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. It's not that I don't identify, but I have a degree from the University of Natal. Call that a heritage. I was
just about to say, yeah, that is your constructed heritage in that sense. Lukona, do you want to also talk to us a little bit about how does one then create, for want of a better word, heritage, new heritage? What does one reconstruct and accept? We know what we want to reject, but how do we move towards then claiming and owning this university space?
I don't think that's a difficult process, because we literally have to come together and say, what is it that we want to be? An institution of African learning is literally a slogan that was created by some people. I don't know how it came about. as I did say, I don't even think we have a Department of African Studies. But I think we have to come together and say, what is it that we want to be? As a university, we have never come together to say, what is it that we want to be? We have reacted. Even the decolonization is a reaction. And those who react against decolonization are reacting against a reaction.
Thank you, Prof. Lukona,
thanks.
There's also another comment here, and maybe you could tie into what you're about to say. Somebody posting that our student leadership is reflective of a serious lack of leadership in the political landscape. So your comment there, and maybe we will counter that with another comment that is talking about management being deaf. So two very different, distinctly polar senses of where students are and where management is.
I think let me start with the heritage question, Mahesh, because it's a very important question. And Prof. Zulu says we have not come together. The difficulty of a university, of course, unlike the family structure, is that many of the people who come into a university are in transit. So it's quite a transient space. Students are here for 4 years, some like myself, 10 years, and become part of the establishment in one way or the other. But you still continue to fight for space and hold power to account, even at the institutional level, because we can't hold power outside of the institution accountable and yet fail to do so within the institution. And so this idea of what type of heritage do we then create for our institution, it appears simple that we should sit down and talk about it, but it's also a very difficult task, because there is part of the heritage that has almost been immortalized in the institution through scholarship endowments, for example. So some people have written their names into the heritage of the institution in perpetuity, or endowments of certain research funds and so on. But I do think that an in principle conversation should be, are there artifacts of the past that should not gain a place of prominence in our institution? Who actually cares for the King George V statue? So people are outraged when students paint over the statue and call it vandalize the statue. Students viewed it as an expression of the rejection of what King George V stood for. And yet nobody has cleaned up the statue. The statue looks exactly as it did since March, April 2015, if not worse. So who actually cares about these props, if we were to call them, these heritage props? Who cares about them, and who is the custodian of these heritage props? And if nobody cares about them, why should they continue to exist? Or how can they be repurposed or donated to museums? Because part of heritage that is unwanted in society, by the way, there's a reason why museums exist, is so that they can house heritage that is definitely part of where that society comes from and the anthropological evolution of the people of that society. But there is an agreement that we do not want this to be in our popular living memory, because that is what memorabilia and props such as statues does. They keep a particular heritage in the living daily memory because you encounter it frequently and regularly. So I think we need to discuss what are those props that we can do away with. But why I raised the question, the name of Mabel Palmer, was that at times there is a mistake that some people will say, oh, Mabel Palmer was white and therefore her name should go. But I was trying to say, in the complex makeup of our university, there were people who were so pioneering, such as Mabel Palmer, who were already standing up against discrimination at a time that it was unpopular, were still for white people to do so. So we must be able to differentiate these names and these people and what they mean. So Howard himself did not ask to be at UKZN, but he definitely did fight in World War I and represents a particular historic moment. So I'm trying to say, in this heritage, and you spoke about human heritage, because it's not just the heritage that we see. What about the intangible heritage? And that human heritage, for me, should find its expression in the manner in which we teach. I mean, I've fought with some people who say, you tutor for an academic and they tell you, no, since 1980 something, this is how we did it. And I say, but this is not 1980 something. The type of people you are dealing with are different students. The society you are dealing with is a different society. So how do you repurpose your instructional material, your pedagogies, your curriculum? And when we talk about curriculum, what exactly are we talking about? We're not saying people should not study Karl Marx, but we are posing the question on why is it easy to encounter Karl Marx in all levels of study, first year, second year, third year, and it is so difficult to encounter an H.I.E. Dlomo or any of the new African movement intellectuals in South Africa who are trying to intellectualize about the new African, whether you agree with them ideologically or not, but what does it mean when their writings and their literature is cast to the margins, and I only encounter it out of curiosity at the library? So what does that ethos of being a premier university of African scholarship means? And what distinguishes African scholarship from European scholarship? In part, it is for African scholarship to respond to the problems and the travesties that are faced by the African people today and historically, so that it is not a difficulty. There are lecturers, students would want to do a paper or a thesis on land reform, and some lecturers will say, no, land reform is a political issue. And yet land dispossession can be studied intellectually so that you show how it has devastated the human experience of Africans. So those are the type of things we talk about when we say we need a curriculum that is repurposed. And so you talk about leadership management as well, away from the heritage question. You know, this question about students management is fundamentally a question about the structure of power. And I wonder whether academics and university managers don't exaggerate the power that they have, because that's where the problem comes in. If there's a structure of power in the university, the person who's at the bottom of that structure of power is the student. So the student can't be given the same level of power as management unless we are making an admission that the perceived power that university managers have is actually fictitious. And if that perceived power is indeed fictitious, we must reach that point of admission, because it's going to help us to reconfigure power relations between the students, the academics, and the managers. However, within this establishment called the university, it is okay for some to act in this power hierarchy as the ultimate powerful people. But when you come before them with issues, they then say, as Prof. Zulu says, and I did make this admission in my presentation, that some of the issues students protest about have nothing to do with what is happening inside the university. They are about struggles out there in society. And because of this notion of the university as a microcosm of society, students then find this, and at times the university is a safe space for protest, by the way, because sometimes it's harder to organize outside the university. That's why I was saying, then those who are in power must be able to dynamically respond to protest. They must be able to say, students, I don't have power to do 1, 2, 3. Let us all march to the government. It shouldn't be the responsibility of the student only, because at times, even academics and managers have stood back and said students are doing the right thing. Finally, we might win this one, but they don't act in solidarity. So one of the things that is absent in the present day protest, which might have created the problem Professor Naidu is alluding to, of a narrow protest repertoire, is that there is no longer solidarity between faculty and students. Previously, there used to be solidarity between faculty and students, and that's why some academics would be banished, because they were seen as evoking students into protest against the then establishment before 1994. What has suddenly happened now is a parting of ways. The academics are lonely, the students are lonely, they encounter each other in what I now proposed might be fictitious power relations, where one perceives themselves powerful than the other, but in the broad spectrum of reality and society, both are actually powerless and need to confront the powerful for their lot to be together. So that's what I would propose, that we need to examine this question of the structure of power in the university. And if we agree that there is maybe a problematic with that structure of power, it might bring, instead of there is the them and us narrative currently now, the othering by students and management. And you need to cross that bridge in order for your protest to have a semblance of acceptability. Because as much as people may say there is no protest against protest, the reality is that there are people who are extremely uncomfortable. The minute they see 50 people gathered in the university space, they already want to run away rather than to find out what is going on.
Thanks, Lakona. And ending on that note, people, we have the last few minutes, and I want to pose the same question to both the panelists to wrap up, but to also address this. And it comes from a student, Pilani, who says it is a student that can give the best answer. And we completely agree with you. And this is why Lakona is our speaker here, because he's straddling two spaces and two identities in a sense. But the second part of Pilani's comment is what I want both speakers to respond to as they give us their last minute in wrapping up. Pilani is alluding to the fact that protest is common, and it's common that around the world protest is violent in nature. How would we respond to that? Because he's not saying something that is untrue, but what is our response to that? That protest is violent out there in the macrocosmic space. So it stands to reason that it will be violent within our university spaces as well. What is our response to that? Because I think ultimately, aside from the discourse and the discussion and the contestations around everything that we've raised here, what really pains students and staff is, notwithstanding the embedded, entangled power relations, the violence is something that is deeply, is there another way? Is there another way to protest as effectively and to ensure that we protest until we are heard? Are there not lessons in history, where there have been extremely powerful forms of protest, violent even, but not in a physical sense? And I'm thinking of Gandhi, I'm thinking of Martin Luther King, I'm thinking of other kinds of student protests as well, where the four that sat there at the Woolworths counter, they practiced to be violently non-violent. So I'm saying, is there another way to protest violently without giving up our souls and our bodies? So maybe the last minute, it's a big question, and I'm asking you to give me a quick answer, but this is what I think we were wanting to explore, and that's the whole point of Dr. Masando bringing us together, to sit together and interrogate this. Is there another way?
Okay, quick one from me on this question. And somebody on the chat thread actually said maybe we should have conceptualized violence, what we mean by violence. And maybe they are correct, because we've got to ask certain questions. Is burning a tire in front of the main entrance, gate 1 at Howard College, violence? It might be to the person who's unable to access their office. To the person doing it, in actual fact, it might be a repertoire that they are using as a disruption, as a form of disruption. Because comfortability can't coexist with protest. Then there is no protest. People must be uncomfortable. People must be, the normal order or the status quo must be disrupted. So there may be acts that we call violent acts that are not necessarily violent acts, but we might need another day to explore that. But you are quite right, Prof. Naidu. There is nonviolence. Nonviolence has worked in certain instances. In my presentation, I say, one of the assumptions of any protest is that the person you are protesting against has some moral fiber or conscience that you are appealing to. Because nonviolence can't work in a situation where the morality of the powerful no longer exists. And we know this with our own history. In the early 20th century, the form of protest in South Africa was through petitions to the British Crown. That evolved to mass demonstrations and civil disobedience. That was still a form of peaceful protest. But there came a time where civil disobedience also was not appealing, because the morality of the apartheid state no longer existed. And therefore, the mass democratic movement decided to embark on violence to respond to the violence that was being meted out to the black people, both structural violence and physical violence. And I think these distinctions are important. There comes a time when the people you are protesting towards are so amoral that the moral appeal of nonviolence is not possible. That is why I propose in our engagement with the forms of student protest that we have seen, we must juxtapose that engagement with another engagement. How has power ordinarily responded to protest? And have those responses of those who are in power always been adequate, not to fuel this transition, as I am tracing it, even with the South African liberation struggle, that it was never always violent. The violence becomes in the continuum of protest. The violence is at the tail end. And even people who practice violence in protest will tell you exactly at times how they lost confidence in non-violence and transition to violence.
Thank you so much for that, Lukona. Prof. Zulu, the last minute, please.
I think this is a very complex matter. One would have to say violence directed at who? Literally, one word, violence directed at who? Because if it's directed at the source of the problem, that becomes a different issue. But if it is directed at everybody, even people who have nothing to do with the problem, that becomes very complicated and very irrational. That's that. I mean, I agree with everything Lukona has said, excepting I'm just asking that last question, violence directed at who? That's the only way that we would deal with the justification or non-justification of the violence aspect in the protest.
Thanks, Prof. I think you're further contextualizing and troubling the whole notion of violence. I want to thank both the speakers. You've been incredible, and you have served the purpose, because here it's not about neat answers, because there are no neat answers. There are multiple complex questions, and the best we can do is begin to unpack these through dialogue and conversation and begin to trouble these assumptions. And what I love between the speakers is that they've managed to do all of that. It's not about a singularity and an agreement. It's not about consensus. It is about starkly looking and honestly and authentically confronting issues that are critical to us. So thank you both. I'll hand over now to Dr. Zondi, who is going to close us in the last minute or two, and thank everybody.
Thank you so much, Professor Mahesh, and greetings, everyone. I would like to acknowledge all the discussions that have happened. I must really say that they have tackled a giant that has been not making sense to a lot of people. What caught my eye, I sort of went to read around, what is efficacy, because it is a concept much more relevant in the context of protest, because at some point, other than just, trying to run away from understanding the intentions behind protest or trying to accept it as a catchy buzzing word, there must be at some point a space where we analyze the potency, the benefits, or begin to understand both endogenous and exogenous factors. And I'm happy to say that the intergenerational perspective that one has gathered in this space somehow, creates an unwritten but insightful, understanding of what we can do in order to chart our way forward. So I believe that everyone who is here has sort of benefited from the discussions. But let me just head straight to acknowledging our panelists. I would like to begin by acknowledging our former Professor Suramuthi. The journey started with him, and if it wasn't for his approval, I don't think we would have progressed to this public space where everyone is invited to listen from very well informed panelists. And I would also want to acknowledge our current acting dean, our very own Queen Professor Mahesh, thank you so much for approving. If it wasn't for your sound and relevant leadership, you would have said no, because I mean, what's new about protest? But you know what? You are also in a journey of finding solutions so that we are all arrived at a point where we say we equally embrace each other and we respect, you know, even the power structures that may have existed or may have been, you know, the source of the protest that we are seeing. So I must say that the leadership that you have provided is very sound and relevant. And again, to our panelists, what I like is the intergenerational perspective that has been provided in the space. One of the writers, which I'm not able to quote, was once said, we need such open spaces for us to, you know, to agree and not agree, you know, amicable, for as long as there's insight that would benefit. Because I believe that when we tackle issues of protest, we all have different, you know, layers of understanding. Hence, it has been acknowledged as a very complex. But what I would like to congratulate the School of Social Sciences as well as the Culture Cluster is to say we need to collapse this, you know, and then find solutions moving forward. Professor Zulu and Mr. Lukona, I think the presentations that we've listened to you is not an ordinary, you know. And myself, having been at the university, I don't know for how many years, I didn't know the historical trace, you know. But thank you so much that I've come to understand even, you know, the pedagogical lenses, which I think will remain, you know, our notes moving forward. And I have confidence in saying that if we are still battling as to, are we really at having a heritage or we not? But I think the discussions that have been tabled here would somehow take us to the direction. I would also want to acknowledge Professor Mahesh. She's an anthropologist, and you know, every time she does presentations or she's facilitating, you really you see that coming through, that she's an anthropologist and she's embracing everyone. She does not take side. Thank you so much, Professor, because some facilitators, you would easily say, oh man, there is somehow, you know, a level of biasness. But how you have welcomed, you know, both questions have been can be justified, you know, as on the level of professionalism. Thank you so much. I'd also like to acknowledge Dr. Kumede, who was our program director when we initially started. Thank you so much for officiating the space. And again, I would like to also extend my recognition to Dr. Masondo. Thank you so much, Dr. Masondo, for not only just pleasing the MENCO or whoever, you know, you presented yourself, but implementation is always key. So whatever that you see, that you said you will do is indeed, you know, coming out clearly as to say, what do you want to see? And where do you want to see the culture cluster within the School of Social Sciences achieving? Not only for your selfish gain, but even for the future generations to come. Thank you so much. Ngingathi nje inisizulu siyabonga, and I think you have put yourself to the task that we would expect, you know, to hear a lot of these series coming up in a form of, you know, continuity, or in a form of, you know, taking another route, because it did come across that, you know, this is quite a complex issue, and we cannot say once because we have looked at one aspect, therefore all the answers it is not homogeneous at all. To the corporate relations, Xoliswa Zulu, Makeba, siyabonga kakhulu for organizing this webinar. Ntwana, your leadership contributed to the tangible success. It is a tangible success because it did take place. To Urilen and Kosinati, thank you so much for providing technical skills. And I wish to be tutored by you guys because I seem to be lacking in that technology. Thank you so much. The poster was really, you know, encouraging, you know, all various stakeholders to be part of this very much a robust discussion. Shakila, thank you so much. Your professional engagement with us, you know, kind of got me, you know, looking forward to say, I really want to be part of this because, you know, there's level of professionalism. Sijal, thank you so much for the marketing and the promotion of this event. Without you, and even outside UKZN, I don't think it would have been enough for us as the university community to just, converge amongst ourselves, because like I've mentioned, and I'm also noting what Professor Zulu has said, that some of these things, they are not originally, coming from UKZN, but they seem to be historical traits of where we come from. Hence, I spoke about both the endogenous and the exogenous factors. Melissa Murugan, thank you so much for agreeing that you will feature this very much important webinar in the University Indaba. I wish we could extend the time, but we know that time is money and we all also have other responsibilities. But I'd also want to extend our grateful thanks to everyone that came. I would also want to acknowledge our dean, our deans, the VC, the DBSs, cluster leaders, the SRC, the newspapers, and other leaders that are present, and everyone who participated. And I also want to appeal to you by saying that in case you feel that there were questions that you posed and you needed answers, don't be discouraged. You will be attended, and I believe that whatever that you still hoped to hear would also be given another space in the next future. This is our community, and we all must take responsibility to find solutions. I also been asked to say the School of Social Sciences iyabonga kakhulu, and without you, this event would not have been a success. And in the absence of any closing remarks from my seniors, I would like to say the event has come to an end, and I believe that there will be postages that will be communicated to all those, because I also noted that everything that was discussed here, there's transparency because it was recorded. So we will be receiving everything that was discussed. Thank you so much on behalf of my seniors, and thank you so much for trusting me to do this last part of the event. Thank you so much. Ngiyabonga kakhulu.